Dramatic music builds as the screen fades in from black. The roar of jet engines shakes the air while sleek F-22s streak across the sky. Quick flashes cut between a young black woman in flight gear, her eyes locked with determination, and a sprawling military base buzzing with motion. The camera lingers on the stunned faces of personnel watching something incredible unfold. A narrator's voice cuts through the tension with gravity. She was told she didn't belong in the sky, that a black woman had no place in a fighter jet, so they kicked her out of pilot camp and thought that was the end of her story. The screen shifts to slow motion as an F-22 slices through the clouds like a blade, engines roaring, sunlight gleaming off its wings. The narrator continues, but when everything was on the line, and a $200 million jet was about to crash, she did something no one expected. She climbed into the cockpit and changed history. Alicia Freeman always dreamed of flying, not just traveling, not just taking trips. She wanted to control the sky, to sit in the cockpit of a fighter jet, and push beyond the sound barrier. For Alicia, flying wasn't just a dream, it was a calling. Growing up in rural Georgia, far from big cities and even farther from opportunity, her world was small, but her imagination wasn't. On warm evenings, she would lie back on the faded hood of her grandma's old Buick, gaze up at the open sky and trace the paths of fighter jets from the nearby military base. Their thunderous roar wasn't noise to her, it was music. Her grandmother used to say, that girl was born with wings in her spirit. She wasn't wrong. Alicia read everything she could about aircraft. While other kids memorized pop songs, she memorized aircraft specs. F-15, F-16, F-22, she knew them all. She built model jets with her allowance money, then saved up to buy an old joystick and rig a makeshift simulator on a hand-me-down laptop. Her room looked more like a control center than a teenager's space. When she turned 19, Alicia did what most people in her town would never dare to try. She applied to a prestigious pilot training camp, one of the toughest civilian access military flight programs in the country. With only a few slots available and hundreds of applicants, her chances were slim. But Alicia wasn't worried. She had top scores, excellent physical training, and more passion than most people could imagine. When the acceptance email came, she screamed so loud the neighbors thought something had happened. It had. She'd made it. But her celebration was short-lived. From the moment she stepped onto the base, the atmosphere was different. She was the only black woman in her class, and everyone noticed. Some of her fellow cadets gave her forced smiles. Others barely hid their skepticism. Instructors didn't say much, but their tones said everything. She caught whispers in the mess hall, jokes during drills, side comments that weren't meant for her ears, but she heard them anyway. Despite her near-perfect written exam scores and flawless physical evaluations, Alicia constantly felt like she was being tested harder than everyone else. In simulation drills, she often got the older equipment. During evaluations, her feedback was vague or missing altogether. When she asked questions, she was brushed off. Still, she pushed through. She woke up before everyone else, ran longer, studied harder, and flew cleaner simulations than most of her squad. She logged every detail, analyzed every maneuver, and kept improving. Some nights, she practiced hand-eye coordination with a tennis ball and a brick wall for hours. She was driven, focused, and calm, the exact qualities a combat pilot needed, but none of it mattered. One afternoon, after completing a complex simulation flight, one where she successfully evaded 2 enemy aircraft and landed with precision, she was called into the director's office. The colonel didn't look up when she entered. He sat behind a wide metal desk, flipping through a file. "Alicia Freeman," he said flatly. "Yes, sir," she replied, standing tall. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a formal dismissal letter. "You're just not a good fit for combat aviation," he said, not even making eye contact. No details, no second chances, no real reason, just a cold handshake and a door closing behind her. Alicia stood there for a moment, the dismissal letter crumpling slowly in her hand. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply looked at the colonel straight into his eyes and said, "You'll remember this moment." Then she turned, walked out of the office, and off the base, her dream grounded, but not destroyed. Because deep down, Alicia knew, you can clip wings, but you can't kill a fire, and that fire was just getting started. Alicia Freeman stepped off the bus with nothing but a duffel bag, a stack of flight journals, and the heavy silence of failure clinging to her like humidity. Her hometown hadn't changed. The cracked sidewalks, rusted pickup trucks, and sleepy storefronts were all exactly as she remembered. But Alicia had changed. The pilot camp had spit her out, but it hadn't emptied her. Back at her grandmother's house, the porch swing still creaked in the wind. Her room still had jet posters on the walls, and her old model planes on the shelf, frozen mid-dream. But this time, they didn't inspire, they haunted. With no job, and no direction, Alicia took what she could get, a part-time job at a hardware store, where the air smelled like sawdust and tired ambition. She stocked shelves, mixed paint, and carried lumber for people who would never guess that just months ago, she was flying virtual dogfights with future fighter pilots. But at night, everything changed. She built a flight simulator in the garage, using scrap electronics, second-hand VR gear, and parts salvaged from junkyards. The screen flickered, the controls jammed, the graphics lagged, but it was hers, and it worked. Alicia didn't waste time sulking. She downloaded open-source flight data, studied unclassified military aircraft specs, and even taught herself basic coding to improve her simulator. She recreated emergency procedures from memory, simmed weather challenges, and practiced complex maneuvers alone in that garage, until the stars blinked overhead. Some nights, her grandmother would peek in and watch from the doorway, wrapped in a robe, and holding a mug of chamomile tea. "Still flying, huh?" she'd say with a tired smile. Alicia would nod, eyes locked on the screen. She wasn't just training, she was rebuilding her dream. Eventually, the sounds of her late-night simulations caught attention. Local pilots at the nearby civilian airport started to notice, especially one, Captain Juno Blaze Hernandez, a retired Air Force legend, known for once landing a disabled jet during a sandstorm with a broken arm. Blaze had heard the whispers, the girl who got kicked out but kept flying, the one who stayed up past midnight training harder than anyone. He visited her garage one afternoon, arms crossed, watching as Alicia pulled off a flawless barrel roll on a virtual mission she'd coded herself. When she finally noticed him standing in the doorway, she paused. "I don't take breaks," she said flatly. Blaze just smirked. "Didn't come here to interrupt, came here to offer something." Over the next several months, Blaze became more than a mentor. He became Alicia's second set of wings. He taught her the stuff the camp never got around to: real-world flying, engine failures, pressure flying, aerobatic recovery, how to trust your instincts when your instruments go dark, how to feel the aircraft, not just fly it. He pushed her harder than anyone ever had. "Good pilots know how to follow rules," he'd say. "Great ones know when to break them to survive." Under Blaze's wing, Alicia didn't just improve, she transcended. Her precision became razor sharp. Her reaction time was measured in instinct. Blaze watched, again and again, as she aced every maneuver, including a few he hadn't seen since his Air Force days. "You don't fly like someone who wants to prove something," he told her one night after a long session. "You fly like someone who's already there, and is just waiting for the world to catch up." Then, one day, Blaze walked into the garage, holding a manila folder. "This just came across a friend's desk," he said, sliding it over. Inside was an invitation, a rare civilian advisory opening for a classified training exercise at Lockridge Air Base. Low-key, temporary, mostly observation, but there was one line that made Alicia's pulse quicken: "Access granted to select aircraft for systems testing and data feedback." Blaze looked at her with a glint in his eye. "You ready to walk back through the fire?" Alicia stared at the folder. She didn't blink. "No," she said quietly, "I'm ready to fly through." The invitation to Lockridge Air Base had seemed routine, almost boring by Alicia's standards. She wasn't there to fly. She wasn't even supposed to touch the control. As part of a last-minute civilian advisory fill-in, her job was simple: observe training exercises, run diagnostics on data from test flights, and offer performance feedback from a technical perspective. Strictly hands-off. Just clipboard work. Still, she said yes, not because she expected something to happen, but because she'd spent too long waiting for nothing to happen. She knew opportunities didn't always look like doors. Sometimes they looked like cracks in the wall. On the morning of day 2, the sky above Lockridge was clear, a perfect canvas for a 5-jet aerial exercise. The F-22 Raptors glided overhead in formation, slicing through clouds like they were made of glass. Alicia stood with her team on the sidelines, observing telemetry data as the jets climbed into a high-altitude mock dogfight. Then it happened. Jet 4 broke formation. At first, it looked like part of the drill, maybe a maneuver, but the pitch was wrong, the roll was erratic. Alicia's screen started flashing error codes. Engine stability failure, someone muttered. Hydraulics offline, he's losing control. Voices rose over the comms. Someone shouted to the tower. A crew member grabbed a radio. Within seconds, the simulation turned into a real emergency. Jet 4 was spiraling out of control, nosediving toward the southern perimeter of the base, right where the civilian tents and temporary staff quarters were located. The pilot finally ejected, but too late to manually steer the falling craft away from danger. The ground crews scrambled. No one nearby had the clearance, training or recent hours in an F-22 to safely intervene, and the only backup jet, prepped for diagnostics, wasn't even fully cleared for flight. No one knew what to do. No one, except Alicia. She didn't think. She moved. While others shouted and stared at monitors, Alicia was already running, across the concrete, past stunned crew members, toward the idle F-22 with its nose cone up and engines cold. Blaze's voice crackled in her earpiece. Alicia, don't. This isn't your call. That jet's not flight certified. You'll crash it before you take off. But Alicia didn't stop. She reached the cockpit, threw open the hatch, and climbed in like she'd done it 1,000 times. Because she had, in her garage, in her mind, in every simulation she'd ever flown. The F-22 wasn't foreign to her. It was family. Freeman, you're going to get yourself arrested. Or worse. She flipped the switches. The engines coughed, then roared to life. Technicians scattered. Officers shouted. Who authorized that? Get her out of there. That's not a certified pilot. Stop her. But they were too late. Alicia pulled the throttle. The jet surged forward, wheels screaming against the runway. Within seconds, it lifted off. Smooth, controlled, perfect. Everyone below stood frozen. This wasn't some rogue civilian stealing a plane. This was a pilot who knew exactly what she was doing. In the air, Alicia immediately locked onto the falling F-22's trajectory. Her heart raced. Her hands didn't shake. She knew she had one shot. Guide the falling jet off its deadly path before impact. She adjusted her heading, lined up her approach, and pushed the controls into a maneuver most pilots wouldn't dare attempt. A risky thrust vector roll, with emergency thrust calibration, something she'd only ever practiced in her simulator. At the last second, she surged ahead of the spiraling jet, angled her own aircraft, and created a high-speed pressure buffer that altered its descent. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't textbook, but it worked. The damaged F-22 veered just enough to crash into an empty stretch of field, missing the crowded base zone by less than 200 feet. Alicia circled once, then brought her own jet down in a textbook landing. As she taxied to a stop, ground crews ran toward her in disbelief. Alarms still blared, radios buzzed, but she sat in the cockpit, silent and composed. She didn't need to say a word, because in that moment, everyone knew, the girl they said didn't belong in the sky, just saved it. The moment Alicia pulled back on the throttle, and the F-22's engines screamed to life, the world on the ground erupted into chaos. Who gave her access? Shut it down. That jet isn't cleared. She's unauthorized. She could kill herself, but it was already too late. Alicia was airborne. The nose lifted, the wheels tucked in, and the jet pierced upward like a missile. Inside the cockpit, the controls were stiff. The diagnostics hadn't been fully calibrated, but she adapted like second nature. Everything she had trained for in silence, in solitude, was now demanded of her in real time. The sky around her was a blur of motion and noise. The ejected pilot from the failing jet had deployed his chute and was drifting safely. But the real danger, the still airborne spiraling F-22, was seconds from crashing into the base perimeter. From above, Alicia saw it, the jet tumbling like a broken toy, nose first, too fast to autocorrect, too heavy to slow down. Any miscalculation would send it plowing straight into the mess halls, where dozens of people were still inside. No one had a plan, but she did. Alicia took a deep breath, and whispered to herself, "Come on girl, remember the math." It was a maneuver she'd only ever tested in theory, something she'd imagined while tweaking flight software in her garage, a risky intercept that relied on artificial drag, angle vectoring, and high G displacement to redirect a falling aircraft, without making contact. Even Blaze, who'd taught her everything he knew, had called it impossible in real-world conditions. But this wasn't theory anymore. Alicia adjusted her altitude, recalibrated her pitch, and accelerated directly toward the spinning jet. Her F-22 sliced through the sky at full thrust, climbing above the falling aircraft in seconds. She dropped her nose, cut airspeed, then dove at a calculated angle that allowed the pressure wake from her jet's exhaust to nudge the tailspin of the damaged craft. The result, a moment of aerial poetry. The tumbling F-22 jerked off course, not by much, but enough. Enough to send it spiraling away from the base, enough to avoid disaster. It crashed in a barren field, kicking up smoke and debris, but no one was harmed. The ground control tower erupted into stunned silence, but Alicia wasn't done. She circled back and climbed altitude. Then, as if driven by instinct, and something deeper, she initiated a sequence of high-speed aerial maneuvers that left even the most battle-hardened flight instructors frozen in place. She performed a snap roll at low altitude, then pulled into a vertical cobra climb, flattening into a horizontal drift, with a stall correction so precise, the flight tech scrambled to replay the telemetry. "Who is she?" one officer asked, eyes locked on the sky. "That's not protocol, that's art." It wasn't a show. Alicia wasn't showing off. This was muscle memory, heart and years of fire, finally being set free. She moved the jet like it was an extension of her body, and for the first time, the sky felt like it truly belonged to her. When she returned to base, her landing was smooth, silent, and perfect. As the cockpit opened, she removed her helmet and exhaled slowly. A crowd was gathering on the tarmac. Some clapped, others just stared, wide-eyed, still trying to process what they had seen. Blaze stood among them, jaw slightly open. She stepped down calmly, her boots hitting the ground like punctuation marks on a rewritten history. No grand speeches, no fist pumps, just one quiet truth hanging in the air. The woman they said didn't belong had just saved their life, and she did it in their jet, in their sky, on her own terms. When Alicia stepped out of the F-22, the weight of the world still hung on her shoulders, but something had shifted. It wasn't just the jet she had landed, it was the story she had reclaimed. At first, there was only silence. No one moved. The air was thick with disbelief. Dozens of officers, cadets, and base personnel stood frozen, their eyes locked on the young woman who had just done the impossible. Then came the first slow clap, followed by another, and another. Within seconds, the air was filled with thunderous applause. People were cheering, shouting, some even shaking their heads in amazement. Others simply stood with their hands on their heads, stunned. The base commander pushed his way through the crowd, eyes wide. His voice dropped to a whisper as he turned to his chief of operations and asked, "Who is she?" He had no idea that the woman who had just pulled off the most daring mid-air recovery in the base's history was the same one who had been kicked out of flight camp less than 2 years earlier. But he would know soon enough. Within hours, Alicia's flight was under review, standard protocol for any unauthorized operation, especially one involving classified aircraft. But what the review uncovered only deepened the impact of what she had done. Her intercept maneuver wasn't just risky, it was brilliantly calculated. Her landing, despite the diagnostic jet not being fully calibrated, was flawless, and her decision to act, despite protocol, had saved lives, protected over $200 million in assets, and prevented a major security incident. By the end of the week, Alicia's name had spread like wildfire across military and aviation circles. Flight schools were dissecting her maneuver. Defense analysts called her actions textbook under fire, even though there was no textbook for what she did. Pilots across the country were asking, why haven't we heard of her before? When they found out she had been dismissed from training camp, not for failure, but for not fitting the mold, a larger conversation began to stir. And then came the offer, a direct commission, a fast-track entry into the Air Force's elite pilot program, a personal invitation from the same branch that once told her she wasn't good enough. It would have been easy to say yes. After all, it was everything she once wanted. The uniform, the wings, the title. But Alicia paused. She looked around and thought about all the girls who reminded her of herself. Smart, capable, and overlooked. The ones with big dreams and nowhere to put them. The ones who never even made it to the front gate of a training camp. So instead of joining the program, Alicia turned it down, respectfully, but firmly, and in its place, she launched her own mission. She took the media attention, the sudden buzz, and the corporate interest, and poured it into a bold new venture, Freeman Skies, a non-profit flight school and mentorship program dedicated to training young women of color in aviation. The school started small, one borrowed hangar, 2 trainers, and a chalkboard full of flight paths, but it grew fast. Within a year, they had sponsored their first 5 students. By year 2, they had partnerships with local airports and aviation academies. Alicia didn't just teach them to fly, she taught them resilience, precision, focus. She taught them that being underestimated is not a curse, it's a weapon when you know how to use it. Her students called her Captain Freeman, not because of rank, but out of respect. To them, she wasn't just a pilot, she was proof.
proof that you can be grounded and still rise, that rejection doesn't define your altitude, that sometimes the sky opens after the door slams shut. Alicia Freeman became a legend, not because she followed a flight path, but because she made her own. Alicia Freeman's journey wasn't just about flying a jet, it was about defying every limit placed on her because of her race, her gender, and where she came from. It was about rising above the voices that told her she wasn't good enough, that she didn't fit the mold of what a fighter pilot should be. She wasn't just facing physical challenges, she was battling a system built on old stereotypes and rigid expectations that defined who belonged in the sky. When Alicia was dismissed from pilot camp, the world gave her a hard no. They told her she didn't belong, that a black woman in a fighter jet was too much of a stretch, too big of a risk, too big of a change for their narrow vision of who could soar through the clouds. But Alicia didn't take that rejection lying down. Instead, she took it as fuel for the fire. She didn't quit. She didn't give up on her dream. Instead, she turned rejection into resilience. She threw herself into self-teaching, building her own flight simulators from scratch, studying aviation manuals by night, and pushing herself to perfect her skills, even when no one believed she could. Alicia didn't wait for someone to hand her a chance. She carved her own path, proving that the difference between rejection and success isn't about talent alone. It's about persistence, grit, and the will to never stop pushing forward. When the world told her no, Alicia taught herself how. She learned to fly on her own terms, acquiring knowledge and skills that would take others years to master in formal settings. She didn't just rely on theory or the traditional classroom. Alicia became her own teacher, mentor, and cheerleader. Every failure became a lesson, every setback, an opportunity to push even harder. She spent hours in the garage, piecing together parts of old aircraft manuals, building her own simulations to recreate flight scenarios, and researching everything about the plane she dreamed of flying, specifically, with no one but herself to rely on. Alicia proved that greatness isn't something you're handed, it's something you fight for, train for, and believe in, even when no one else does. Her dedication paid off when she was thrust into a high-stakes situation at Lockridge Air Base, where in the face of disaster, Alicia made the impossible happen. She climbed into a fighter jet that was meant for diagnostics, without permission, without hesitation, and saved a $200 million aircraft, and the lives of countless people in one bold maneuver. Her actions weren't just extraordinary, they were a resounding statement. Alicia had not only defied the limits set by others, but had rewritten the rules for what it means to be a fighter pilot. She wasn't just a survivor of the system, she was a challenger, a trailblazer. Her story isn't just inspirational, because Alicia didn't just make a name for herself, she changed the entire narrative of aviation. She proved that the cockpit isn't reserved for one type of person, it's a place for anyone who's willing to fight for it. By shattering the stereotypes and prejudices that once held her back, Alicia cleared the runway for future generations of pilots, particularly young women of color, who had never seen themselves reflected in the seats of fighter jets before. She opened the doors for anyone who had been told no, and showed them that the sky isn't the limit, it's only the beginning. Through her strength, resilience, and unwavering belief in herself, Alicia Freeman didn't just break barriers, she tore them down completely, leaving a path wide open for the pilots of tomorrow. Narrator, voiceover, every day, someone's being told they're not good enough, not ready, not the right fit. But remember Alicia, the girl they kicked out, who flew back in, and left everyone speechless. Call to action. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more real and inspired stories, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that rejection is not the end, it's just runway for your next takeoff. On-screen text, fly your own path, Alicia, and look where it took her. And with a silhouette of Alicia beside a jet at sunset, the words, inspired by every woman who wasn't supposed to fly, and did anyway.